Welcome to Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management, a weekly conversation with area leaders about how to persevere during uncertain times. Now here's your host, Gary Shorman.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times. We have an interesting program today because it deals with something many of us are engaged with, and that is hunting, fishing, etc., things that we enjoy being a part of Kansas. But beginning this fall, Kansas will no longer have a fall turkey hunting season due to declining populations in the state and regional levels. And our guest today is one of those who helped make that difficult decision, and I say difficult because it is. Our guest is Kent Fricke with Kansas Wildlife and Parks, and he is a small game biologist with the state of Kansas. So, Kent, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely, Gary. Pleasure to be here.
You know, one of the things that you get into when you have one of the decisions, you hear the decision as somebody like myself, it's okay, no turkey season this fall. That's a bad deal, isn't it? But what goes into that process? Before we go there, Kent, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
Absolutely. And again, Gary, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. And it's really good to have this discussion. So, I'm a small game biologist with Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. And I grew up in eastern Nebraska, actually, near the town of Columbus. And went to undergraduate degree, got an undergraduate degree at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Worked for a few years, primarily in Nebraska on different wildlife jobs, and then got a master's degree down in Eastern Texas at Stephen F. Austin State University. Then was back in Lincoln, Nebraska for a few more years of graduate school, and then came here into Kansas in 2016 as a small game biologist. And so been around the country a little bit, and I've always had a passion for wildlife and wildlife management specifically, and been a great fit here in Kansas for me.
Well, Kent, one of the things I know that these decisions don't come easily because there's a lot involved. There's everything from people coming in to hunt, the people that you and I that have grown up hunting. I know you're a hunter, you grew up on a small family farm. So it's one of those things, it's not an easy decision to make. What went into the whole thought process for actually canceling the turkey hunting season?
Absolutely, and that's a really great question because one of the things that I think Wildlife and Parks really excels at as an agency and as a public agency is that we do have a very transparent process. And so we've actually been talking about our concerns from a staff level with turkey populations throughout the state for over 10 years now. Our peak population of turkeys was about 2008, kind of the late 2000s period. And so we've been on a fairly consistent decline of turkeys since then. And with that, every year, I, as the turkey biologist, as part of my responsibilities, am up front in front of our commission, the Wildlife and Parks Commission, every year to talk about turkeys. Whether we're recommending any changes or not, we're presenting information concerning the populations, the status of harvest for both the spring and fall seasons, and just what our overall thoughts and concerns are with the population. And so, again, every year since we started a turkey season back in the 1980s, in this case for the fall season, we've been talking about that openly with the commission in public meetings. And so, but also in terms of the fall season, we've been talking about it really since 2015 time period when we saw these consistent declines and had at least some initial thoughts of we may need to make some reductions to try and reduce some of this decline. And so some of the things that we talk about in those meetings and certainly talk about internally with other biologists include population data. So we have a survey that's done 4 times a year that counts the number of turkeys that we see along routes, in this case conducted by rural mail carriers in the state. So we look at population numbers. We also do brood surveys. So we also ask those rural mail carriers during July to also count the number of poults that they see along with the adult birds. And then we also do an internal brood survey that's conducted by Wildlife and Park staff that count other species as well. And so we're constantly looking at monitoring and assessing the population from an adult abundance type standpoint, and then also production from year to year. In addition, we conduct postseason harvest surveys for both the spring and fall seasons. And each year that's an email survey now that goes out to hunters after the season's been concluded, to a randomly selected number of hunters. And then those hunters report back what they've harvested, where they primarily hunted, what day of harvest, all that collective information that we can then as biologists come back and analyze and assess different components of the turkey population and effects of harvest, even including hunter satisfaction. And that's something that we've seen a decline in hunter satisfaction for a number of years as well. And so all of those factors kind of get discussed, analyzed, and presented to the commission and thereby the public to have input on during those meetings.
One question I was thinking about, is this unique to Kansas?
In terms of the population decline?
Yeah.
Not to a certain degree. This is a trend that we've seen in turkey populations kind of beginning in the southeastern United States, and then not necessarily moving, but we see a trend where those were some of the first turkey populations where we noticed declines, again, kind of in the early 2000s. And then slowly we've seen a similar trend in other states. And so, for example, Missouri, Arkansas saw declines in their turkey populations, a few years before Kansas and Nebraska started seeing similar trends in population decline. But one of the most concerning or important components of that is that the consistent trend that has led to those lower production, the lower production in each of the states, or lower populations, sorry, is low production. And when you have a population of turkeys that isn't producing as much as, to replace itself, then you obviously have a declining turkey population. And we expect that with a number of different species. I think pheasants and quail, we see different impacts year to year from climate. Did we, in the eastern Kansas, did we have a wet year that we had a lot of flooding where we lost a lot of nests? Or did we see drought in western Kansas and therefore resources weren't available for young poults, lower survival for adults? So we certainly see year to year variation, but unfortunately we haven't seen a consistency to where populations bounce back in the good years, in the years that we don't have flooding or that we don't have drought. And so those are a couple of things that we've really tried hard to assess, not only within the state of Kansas, but also looking to other states to see what factors have either changed or are consistent, and learning from other states as well in terms of trying to get ahead of some of these population declines.
Well, Kent, the commission actually makes the decision. You make the presentation, you talk about the numbers, and by the way, rural mail carriers, I'm going to look at them differently. They're out actually counting birds as they're doing their job every day. So good job for them.
And
When
and
you made, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, that is relatively unique. There are certainly a few other states that do that as well, but we're extremely fortunate. We as Wildlife and Parks have been working with rural mail carriers statewide to do surveys since the 1960s. And so this is a long-term data set that's extremely helpful. I mean, I couldn't do my job as effectively without this. And so in terms of rural mail carriers and their usefulness and benefit to the agency in completing these surveys is absolutely paramount to what we do.
Well, you make the presentation after you get all the statistics in, all the data in, you do that, you make the presentation. Were you surprised that the state ultimately just decided to cancel the season for this fall?
I don't think I was as surprised, and as you mentioned earlier, I wasn't happy with the decision. Excuse me. Nobody's happy when we reduce hunter opportunities and opportunities for people to be in the outdoors pursuing, in this case, turkeys. This is not a recommendation or a decision that we as Wildlife and Park staff or the commission took lightly at all. And so, but that said, we as staff felt that it was necessary as biologists, and looking at the status of our turkey population, the status of the harvest, And then also just it's been in I guess I think it's good to point out that we've been having conversations about the fall season since 2015, 2016. So over the last 7 or 8 years, we've talked with the commission about the importance of the fall season, and more specifically, the importance of and for context too, in the case of the fall season, why it's so important from a harvest standpoint is that we allow harvest of hens, and that's very traditional. The traditional fall turkey season is focused on finding flocks of birds, a lot of them that have been produced that year, breaking them up, calling them back in, and harvesting one bird or so out of that, whatever the bag limit allows. And so, because the fall season allows hens to be harvested, and hens are obviously such an important component of production, which we've identified as
Mhm.
a limiting factor, that's been one of the areas of concern about the fall season for the number of years, and factors in importantly into the assumptions that we make in harvest management. And so, as I mentioned, we've been talking in varying degrees about the fall season with the commission, and even in previous years had come forward with recommendations to suspend the season in specific units. We had not specifically recommended a change statewide until last year, but we had been making recommendations over the last 7 or 8 years to to suspend the fall season in selected units where we've had some of the most concern. But in terms of context, because of consistency and a desire to have some consistency across the state, I think that's where more we landed this year on an overall statewide recommendation.
Kent, is the spring season also at jeopardy?
Certainly not what I would consider in jeopardy, and I certainly do not foresee any circumstance where we do not have a spring turkey season. That said, we have also made a number of other changes to the spring season as well. Those include reduced bag limits. So we're now at a one bird bag limit statewide for the 2024 season. And we've also made changes to the number of non-residents who can obtain a turkey permit. So for the spring season, and so for 2024, the spring 2024 season will be the first season we've ever had a draw system and a quota for non-residents in the state. And so, as I mentioned, in addition to the fall season, made a number of other changes, and the moving to a non-resident quota and a draw process for getting applications for those permits is new, and is something that we'll be working through this spring as we get those permits allocated to non-residents who apply for them, and see how that plays out with our population and harvest numbers as well.
Ken, if you'd hold on for just a second, I want to come back and talk about maybe some other small game birds that you're working with and talking about, and maybe some of the other processes that go on for some of the larger animals as well. Our guest today is Kent Fricke, is small game biologist with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. We'll be back after this.
The most successful investors are those that can keep their emotions in check and take a longer-term view at what portfolios will be worth 3 to 5 years down the road. I'd say that's the most important in determining what investor outcomes are. Market corrections will continue in the future. We've seen many of them over the years, only to see equity prices rise higher, and that'll be the case in the future.
Worth Wealth Management, enhancing lives and strengthening families.
Welcome back to Forward Ever, leading in challenging times. I guess this is a leadership challenge. Kent Fricke is our guest today. Kent is a small game biologist with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. And Kent, it's challenging when you have to make these kind of decisions or recommendations to the commission, because there's money involved with people buying hunting licenses. There's people who have grown up hunting and doing that. There's a lot of challenges involved. Where was your first challenge when you started into this process? You learned somewhere along the line to take on big issues. Where was that? Was it your family farm? Was it somebody you got to know along the way?
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is really during my undergraduate degree, I was heavily involved with our student chapter of the Wildlife Society, took on leadership roles there, and really just utilize that as an opportunity to grow the student chapter there in Lincoln, Nebraska. And also just you always have the interpersonal relationships that you develop, and of course most of them are really great. But you always have to overcome, certain challenges and things too, in order to get our goals and objectives accomplished. And so that was really one of the first times in terms of being a professional in the career path, that was able to take that on in a larger capacity, and was had a really great time doing it.
What are the challenges you're looking at now? Because you work with small game, basically. Are there other small game animals, birds, et cetera, that you're looking at right now for the same types of recommendation?
Certainly nothing in terms of coming down the line in terms of internal conversations about changes in regulations. Turkeys are unique from a harvest management standpoint. They're somewhere between a deer that reproduces consistently, but not that many per year, and they're somewhere between a deer and a pheasant or quail that produce a
Mhm.
lot, but don't have quite the consistency. And you have kind of more of those boom or bust years where reproduction is either really good or relatively poor. And so they're somewhere in between. And so they are challenging and unique in that aspect. We have bag limits, per season, basically, for things like turkey and deer and elk or pronghorn, kind of the big game side of things. But we have daily bag limits for pheasants and quail because the impacts of harvest and our assumptions with harvest are very different for those species. And so, like I say, turkeys are kind of in between, but so to that extent, there's no active conversation internally or with the commission about changes to other species like quail, pheasants, or prairie chickens. That said, on another topic, so we kind of the two areas that we really focus on from an agency are our harvest management decisions. So how much or how little harvest do we think we should have on an individual resource, an individual game species, which is what we've primarily been talking about with the commission for turkeys in this case. But the other aspect is habitat management, and that's really in many cases the bulk of what we do as a wildlife agency. We only have a few people in terms of statewide coordinators like myself that deal primarily with the harvest management and recommendations on that front. But we have tons of people out on the landscape and staff who work not only with wildlife and parks, but with our conservation partners across the state to do the active habitat management that needs to be done on the landscape. And so, and really, even from a harvest standpoint, the more habitat and the more higher quality habitat that we have out there, that's really the focus of what we do, and that is what leads to better reproduction, better survival of adults, all the things that we consider for harvest management. That's really what we're trying to get to with more and better habitat out on the landscape. And so, to your question, one of the most challenging aspects of my job and the staff, our wildlife biologists out there in the field every day, talking with landowners, cutting trees, disking CRP patches, all those kind of things, is really about how do we create more habitat on the ground. And one of the specific challenges to that in Kansas, a state in the Great Plains, is really how do we maintain and how do we grow the amount of grassland that we have out on the landscape. We've lost a lot of grass over the years to whether it's been conversion to cropland or conversion now with woody plant encroachment and primarily cedar trees out on the landscape. And so all of these things have really changed the landscape that we work in and that our wildlife species depend on. And so you have grassland dependent species, specifically like pheasants or greater prairie chickens, lesser prairie chickens, that when we reduce that, the amount of usable grassland habitat that they have to grow, to reproduce in, that's where we see the biggest reasons for decline in these species. And so that's one of our biggest challenges is, and that we work with daily, not only internally as a Wildlife and Parks, a state wildlife agency, but also with all of our conservation partners, whether it's the Nature Conservancy or Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife programs, a number of other resources within the state, and even with folks like Kansas Grazing Lands Coalition, trying to connect more with ranchers and landowners on the landscape. And so that's where we really have the most challenges, and that's where we put the bulk of our resources.
I know you work with a small game. I know there's a lot of discussion going on, and we hear it out here on the feeding of animals, whether it be deer, and I know some of that is also done with turkeys as well. There's concerns that creates issues. Where do people go to get more input or to provide input to people making the decisions on that?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is even just look at individuals or look at yourself. If you look at your own practices, if you are a landowner or if you have an opportunity to hunt and potentially bait or feed on the property that you hunt. As you mentioned, there are a number of concerns for our wildlife species, whether it's deer or a number of other ones, but also including turkeys. There's a lot of concern that and I say we certainly as a state wildlife agency, but also biologists across the country, when we talk about turkey declines, and there's certainly a role that baiting and feeding may be playing in some of those aspects. And we've talked about a number of those in public forums, in informational sessions to our commission. But in terms of resources that are available, certainly anyone is always welcome to come to a public commission meeting and voice their opinions there. We certainly have resources on our Wildlife and Parks website, and even just giving me or any other biologist a call in terms of any specific concerns or questions or comments that you have. We're certainly always willing to speak with anyone, whether that's a hunter, a landowner, an out-of-state hunter interested in coming to Kansas. We have those conversations every day, and again, I would always welcome any phone calls here to the Emporia Research Office.
One of those things I know is it's a big deal, whether it be hunting, fishing in the state, those sort of things, where there are different groups that are pulling in different directions on those. And I think being in the middle of that is not only a challenge, but it takes a real leadership role to say, how do you get this done? And I think being able to go to the website, you mentioned the website, Kansas Fish and Game website, does that talk about the meetings, where people go, how they provide input?
Yeah, I believe we have all of that information there. And like I said, I'm not sure what our current plans are moving forward. Or nothing's currently planned in terms of next meetings or anything, but certainly there's some information there. And again, I'm always happy to get a phone call or an email and address those issues as well.
Well, Ken, appreciate having you on the show. Appreciate your efforts to try to keep wildlife not only abundant, healthy, otherwise, so that we can continue doing what we do in Kansas and other states around the Midwest. I know you like to hunt and fish as well, so trying to do the right thing for everyone is a challenge, but appreciate the work you do to get there.
Absolutely. Very happy to be doing hopefully a good service to the state.
Kent Fricke has been our guest here, a small game biologist with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. Kent, thanks for being here, and thanks to you for listening and watching Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, brought to you by Worth Wealth Management. I'm Gary Shorman.
Thanks for joining us for Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management. Join us right here next week for another episode with host Gary Shorman. Until then, remember to move forward ever, backward never.